Every nation owes money, from the richest economies to the poorest corners of the planet. The United States owes trillions, China owes trillions, Europe owes trillions, and even small developing countries carry debts so large that they could never realistically repay them in full. Governments borrow to function, corporations borrow to survive, and households borrow to simply get through the month. Debt has become so normalized that people stopped questioning the most important question of all. If every nation on Earth is drowning in obligations, then who is actually on the other side of the equation? Who is lending to the entire world? This question is more than financial. It exposes the structure of global power. For decades, economists talked about debt as if it were a simple transaction. One country borrowing from another, one institution funding another, one generation financing the next. But the deeper you go, the stranger it becomes. Countries don't just owe money to other countries. They owe money to markets, investors, hedge funds, central banks, foreign creditors, multilateral institutions, and sometimes to themselves through complex financial mechanisms that most citizens don't even know exist. The system is vast, layered, and intentionally difficult to unravel. The global debt today exceeds $300 trillion, a number so large it has no meaning in everyday life. Yet economies continue to function, governments continue to operate, and markets continue to rise, as if the entire world isn't built on a foundation of obligations that can never be fully repaid. Politicians promise balanced budgets while approving record deficits. Central banks tighten interest rates to fight inflation while injecting liquidity to prevent instability. Investors scream about risk, but continue buying the same government bonds they claim are unsustainable. Everything looks contradictory because the system itself was built on contradictions. Debt is not just a burden. It is the operating system of the global economy. It is how countries expand, how infrastructure gets built, how war is financed, how crises are managed, how banks make profits, and how currencies maintain influence. The problem is that this operating system only works as long as people continue believing in it. The moment confidence breaks, the entire structure becomes dangerous because nothing tangible backs this mountain of obligations. What backs it is trust, trust in governments, trust in markets, trust in institutions, and trust in the idea that someone, somewhere, has control. But the truth is far less comforting. No single country controls the entire system. No single institution holds all the leverage. Instead, power is distributed across a network of entities that most people never interact with or even recognize. This is why nations can owe trillions without collapsing. They are not borrowing from a single lender who can demand repayment. They are borrowing from a system that is designed to keep itself alive, even when the numbers no longer make sense. The International Monetary Fund provides loans to countries in crisis, but the IMF itself depends on contributions from member nations. Central banks buy government bonds to stabilize markets, but those same governments backstop the central banks. Hedge funds and institutional investors hold massive amounts of sovereign debt, but their capital comes from pensions, corporate accounts, and global portfolios that stretch across borders. The creditors are everywhere and nowhere at the same time. This is why the question, who really holds the power, is so important. Because if power isn't concentrated in a single nation or a single institution, then the true force behind global stability is something far more fragile. The willingness of millions of actors across the planet to keep believing that the system will hold. And once you understand that, the entire narrative of global debt shifts. The nations don't owe trillions to a single master. They owe trillions to a global machine that needs constant momentum to avoid collapsing under its own weight. In the next part, we will break down how this machine actually works, who fuels it, and why the global debt cycle has turned into the most powerful, yet least understood, force shaping the world today. To understand who truly holds the power, you must first understand how the global debt machine functions. Most people imagine lending as a straightforward exchange. One party provides money, and another repays it with interest. But at the scale of nations, the process becomes almost unrecognizable. Countries don't simply borrow from other countries. They borrow from a web of institutions, markets, and financial ecosystems that operate far beyond the reach of ordinary citizens, and sometimes even beyond the reach of the governments themselves. The first layer of this machine is the sovereign bond market. Every major country issues bonds, promises to repay investors with interest. These bonds are bought by pension funds, hedge funds, asset managers, large banks, and even other governments. But here's the twist. These investors aren't using their own money. Pension funds use the retirement savings of millions of workers. Hedge funds use capital from corporations, wealthy individuals, and global portfolios. Banks use deposits and short-term funding. In other words, countries borrow from the pooled wealth of the entire global economy, not from a single identifiable lender. The second layer is central banks, the institutions that regulate money supply. Central banks buy massive amounts of government bonds, especially during crises, to keep their economies stable. But where does their money come from? It comes from nothing more than the authority to create currency. They don't earn money, they issue it. When a central bank buys a government bond, the country effectively owes money to an institution that can create unlimited funds. This circular arrangement is one of the biggest reasons nations can owe trillions without collapsing. The creditor and the debtor are often different faces of the same system. The third layer is international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, the World Bank, the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, and regional development banks. These institutions provide loans to countries, especially in times of crisis. But again, their money comes from member nations, which themselves are funded by taxpayers, industries, and global markets. So when the IMF lends money to a struggling nation, it is essentially redistributing wealth that originates across dozens of countries and institutions. The system becomes self-referential. One country borrows money that was sourced from other countries that are also borrowing money. The fourth layer is private global capital, the most powerful and least visible force of all. Large asset management firms like BlackRock, Vanguard, Fidelity, and State Street hold trillions of dollars in assets. They buy government bonds, corporate debt, stocks, and global commodities. But the money they manage doesn't belong to them. It belongs to millions of investors, companies, funds, and institutions spread across the world. When a nation borrows money, it may be borrowing indirectly from thousands of sources. A teacher's retirement account in Canada, a corporation's pension fund in Japan, a municipal reserve fund in Germany, or a university endowment in the United States. The lenders are dispersed across continents, demographics, and generations. This structure means no single country or institution owns global debt. Instead, the world is tied together by a shared dependence on financial stability. If one major nation defaults, the shockwaves spread instantly through every layer of the system. Banks lose capital, pension funds lose value, bond markets freeze, currencies fluctuate. Governments face political upheaval. The system is interconnected by design, because interdependence reduces the likelihood that any major player will allow the system to fail. Everyone has something to lose. This brings us to the most overlooked truth. Global debt is not a chain, it is a web. No central entity holds all the strands. Power shifts depending on where the pressure is applied. When interest rates rise, lenders gain power because debt becomes more expensive. When markets crash, governments gain power by injecting liquidity. When currencies weaken, commodity exporters gain influence. And when financial crises emerge, the IMF and central banks become the only institutions capable of stabilizing nations. So who holds the real power? Not a single lender, but the system itself. A system where money circulates in perpetual motion, where debt fuels growth, where lenders depend on borrowers, and where borrowers depend on lenders. The power lies in the machine that keeps everyone tied to everyone else. In the next part, we will break down the hidden vulnerabilities of this system, why a web this interconnected isn't stable forever, what happens when one critical node fails, and how close the world might be to that breaking point. For decades, the global debt machine has appeared unstoppable. Nations borrowed more, markets expanded, institutions adapted, and the system absorbed shock after shock without collapsing. But beneath this apparent stability lies a vulnerability that becomes clearer with every passing year. When everything is connected, everything becomes fragile. A failure in one corner of the system no longer stays contained. It spreads outward, touching institutions, markets, and governments that were never meant to be exposed. The first source of fragility is concentration of risk. Even though global debt is technically held by millions of investors around the world, much of it ultimately flows through a surprisingly small number of critical nodes. A handful of central banks control global liquidity. A few dozen financial giants manage the majority of the world's assets. A small group of reserve currencies underpins international trade, and a limited number of governments issue the bonds considered safe enough to anchor global portfolios. When a single one of these nodes experiences stress, whether a liquidity squeeze, a currency devaluation, or a sudden loss of confidence, the repercussions spread instantly. The system is too centralized to be stable, and too interconnected to be resilient. The second vulnerability comes from the scale of modern debt. The global economy has reached a point where debt expansion is not optional, it is required. Entire nations rely on borrowing to fund basic services, maintain infrastructure, support social programs, and stabilize markets. When growth slows, governments borrow more. When recessions hit, central banks intervene. When crises emerge, international institutions step in. The system has been engineered to survive through continuous injections of liquidity. But liquidity is not infinite, and the appetite of markets is not guaranteed. Once the cost of borrowing rises, or the confidence of investors fades, the entire structure feels the strain immediately. The third vulnerability is global interest rate risk. When major central banks, especially the Federal Reserve, raise interest rates to control inflation, the cost of servicing debt rises everywhere. Countries with weak currencies see their debt burdens explode. Emerging markets struggle to roll over loans. Corporations face refinancing costs that erode profit margins. Investors move money toward safer assets, causing volatility in riskier markets. And because so much of the world's debt is tied, directly or indirectly, to the US dollar, a single shift in American monetary policy affects governments, banks, and businesses from Africa to Asia to South America. Power becomes centralized not in a government, but in the interest rate decisions made by a few policymakers in Washington. The fourth vulnerability lies in the illusion of safety. Many nations issue debt assuming markets will always treat it as reliable, but trust can evaporate quickly. A downgrade, a political crisis, a drop in commodity prices, or a currency shock can turn a stable borrower into a risk overnight. Investors react instantly, withdrawing capital, selling bonds, and demanding higher yields. Once yields rise, refinancing becomes harder. Once refinancing becomes harder, governments face impossible choices: cut spending, raise taxes, borrow more at higher rates, or default. The illusion of safety becomes a trap. The system depends on the belief that nations will always repay. The moment that belief weakens, debt becomes leverage against them. The fifth vulnerability is systemic scale. When a household falls into debt, the consequences affect a family. When a corporation defaults, the consequences affect investors, suppliers, and employees. But when a nation becomes unstable, the consequences spill into global markets, foreign governments, international institutions, and multinational corporations. A sovereign crisis is not an isolated event. It is a shockwave that moves through currencies, trade, commodities, and financial markets. The global system can absorb one crisis, maybe two, but when multiple nations face pressure at the same time, as happened in Latin America, parts of Africa, and sections of Asia, cracks begin to appear in places no one expected. All of this leads to the final and most uncomfortable truth: global debt works until it doesn't. It is not a stable structure. It is a delicate balance that requires constant expansion, constant confidence, and constant liquidity. If any of these elements falter, the system becomes vulnerable to a break. And because the machine is so interconnected, that break will not be gentle. It will be sudden, fast, and far-reaching. In the final part, we will reveal the core question behind the entire system. When everything depends on confidence, who actually holds the power to keep the world from falling apart? And what happens when that power starts to slip? If you want to know who really holds the power in a world where every nation owes money, you have to stop looking at governments and start looking at the numbers that sit beneath the global financial system. These numbers aren't just statistics. They reveal where influence actually lives, who depends on whom, and what happens when the system is pushed 1 inch too far. And once you see the scale of the obligations, you realize the world is operating on a balance so thin that even slight movements at the top can send shockwaves through every economy on Earth. Start with the total global debt, more than $320 trillion, according to the Institute of International Finance. That's nearly 3 times the size of the entire global economy, which sits around 100 trillion. No country, no institution, no coalition of lenders could ever absorb that amount if nations were forced to repay everything at once. This is the first sign that debt is not meant to be repaid. It is meant to be sustained indefinitely. A system built on numbers this large can only function if everyone involved believes it will continue functioning tomorrow. Now look at sovereign debt alone. The United States owes more than $38 trillion and is adding over $2 trillion every year. Japan owes more than $9 trillion, with a debt-to-GDP ratio above 250%. Italy is around 145%, France around 112%, and the United Kingdom close to 100%. Even China, once praised for its disciplined balance sheets, now carries government, local, and hidden liabilities exceeding $12 trillion. Taken together, the world's major economies owe so much that their debts exceed their annual economic output by margins that were once considered impossible. Corporate debt is no different. Global companies owe more than $90 trillion, much of it borrowed when interest rates were close to zero. Now that rates have risen, nearly $5 trillion in corporate bonds will mature within the next 24 months. These companies will not be refinancing at 1 or 2% anymore. Many will face 6, 7, or even 8%, dramatically increasing their cost of survival. A single wave of corporate defaults could destabilize markets across multiple continents. Households add another layer. Consumers worldwide owe more than $50 trillion in mortgages, credit cards, personal loans, and student debt. In the United States alone, credit card balances exceed $1.4 trillion, with average interest rates pushing toward 30%. Europe faces similar pressure, and China's household debt crisis, driven by real estate and consumer loans, has grown to more than 70% of its GDP. When consumers run out of room to borrow, economies slow, tax revenues fall, and governments are forced to borrow even more. But the most revealing number of all sits in the market that underpins the entire system: government bonds. The global bond market is valued at more than $4 trillion, with nearly $200 trillion of that tied directly to sovereign debt. These bonds are held by pension funds, managing the retirements of more than bilhões de pessoas, insurance companies responsible por $70 trilhões emitidos, and investment giants como BlackRock e Vanguard, que cada controla mais de $7 trilhões. When nations borrow, they are borrowing indirectly from the savings, pensions, and financial futures of ordinary people across the world. This is why no nation can default without causing damage far beyond its borders. A default in one country can wipe out pension values in another, destabilize banks in a third, trigger currency devaluation in a fourth, and force emergency interventions from institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. The world isn't held together by cooperation. It's held together by mutual vulnerability. Every country owes trillions because the system needs them to owe trillions. Growth, liquidity, and financial stability depend on debt expanding year after year. So who really holds the power? Not any single lender, not the IMF, not the United States, not China, not the banks or the markets alone. The real power is held by the network, this vast, interconnected web of governments, central banks, institutions, markets, funds, and millions of individual investors whose money circulates through the system every second. The debt machine is too big to control and too interconnected to escape. Power lies not in one institution, but in the collective belief that the system must continue. And here is the truth almost no one recognizes. When everyone owes trillions, the real power belongs to whoever can influence confidence. Because confidence is the only thing holding the entire structure together. Confidence determines whether nations can borrow, whether markets remain stable, whether currencies hold value, and whether investors keep lending. Confidence is the true currency of the modern world. And the moment it breaks, whether through political instability, financial shock, or a crisis of trust, the numbers that once looked abstract suddenly become unavoidable. Debt doesn't collapse because the numbers grow too large. It collapses when belief in the system weakens. And in a world where every nation owes trillions, the greatest power belongs to whoever can keep that belief alive or shatter it.